Leaders of the BRICS group of emerging economies gathered in Rio de Janeiro in 2025 for a high-profile summit. Among the most pressing issues on the agenda were global trade tensions, particularly those linked to tariffs imposed by the United States. While this created a challenging backdrop, the summit carried a sense of anticipation. The organization, originally made up of 5 countries, has been undergoing a dramatic transformation, evolving into a much larger alliance that could reshape how power is distributed in the world economy. The BRICS nations, in their original form, represented Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The name itself started as a catchy acronym used by economists to describe fast-growing economies with significant potential. Over time, these countries realized they had more in common than simply rapid growth. They shared an ambition to amplify their collective influence on trade, finance, and global policy. Together, they represented a significant portion of the world's population and economic output, giving them a strong platform to speak as one voice. For years, the group operated with just those 5 members. However, by 2025, the landscape had changed dramatically. The alliance now included 11 full members, along with 13 official partners and 32 other nations, signaling interest in joining. What began as a relatively compact group has become a sprawling coalition that some analysts describe as one of the most important shifts in global politics and economics in decades. One of the most notable changes took place in January 2025, when Indonesia officially became a member of the group. Indonesia's addition brought a huge consumer market into the fold, along with a strategic presence in Southeast Asia. For many observers, this was a clear sign of how BRICS was no longer limited to a handful of countries, but was increasingly positioning itself as a global force. The expansion process, however, had been underway for some time. In August 2023, Saudi Arabia was invited to join, with membership expected to begin in January 2024. At the start of 2024, 4 other countries became members: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Each of these states offered specific strategic advantages, whether in terms of geography, natural resources, or access to important shipping routes. At the time of the Rio summit, Saudi Arabia had still not finalized its membership. The kingdom was weighing its options, balancing long-standing ties with the United States against the opportunities presented by deeper involvement with BRICS. Analysts noted that this hesitation reflected the complexity of aligning with a group that often takes positions independent of Western powers. The organization's growing weight is visible in the numbers. According to data shared at the 17th BRICS Summit, the expanded group now accounted for more than 45% of global GDP and over half of the world's population. In other words, the BRICS nations collectively represented a larger share of the global economy than ever before. This added scale gave the group a louder voice on international issues and raised questions about how it might influence the financial and political order. While the current members already represent a significant bloc, what caught even more attention was the waiting list. Of the 32 nations signaling interest in joining, 23 had already submitted formal applications. The list of applicants included countries spread across several regions, many of which held important economic or strategic positions. Among them were Bahrain, Malaysia, Turkey, Vietnam, Belarus, Sri Lanka, Mexico, Kuwait, Thailand, and Uzbekistan. The motivations behind these applications varied. For oil-rich states, such as Bahrain and Kuwait, membership would allow them to secure access to new markets for their exports, while also benefiting from BRICS's growing effort to conduct trade outside of the US dollar. For Mexico, the attraction lay in positioning itself as a gateway to Latin America, a move that could give the bloc greater influence across the Western Hemisphere. But Belarus, on the other hand, represented an opportunity for BRICS to extend its reach into Eastern Europe, a region traditionally influenced by the European Union and NATO. One of the main attractions for potential members is the New Development Bank, also known as the NDB. Since its creation in 2016, the bank has financed around 96 major projects worth approximately $32 billion. What sets the NDB apart is that many of its loans are issued in local currencies rather than in US dollars. This approach allows countries to reduce their exposure to exchange rate fluctuations, a problem that can destabilize budgets and undermine economic planning in developing nations. For applicants, gaining access to this alternative financing system is often described as a practical as well as strategic benefit. The July 2025 summit in Rio de Janeiro marked a turning point for the group. While expansion was the headline issue, discussions went beyond simply adding more members. Brazil, which held the presidency at the time, sought to emphasize cooperation within the Global South. The message was that BRICS should avoid positioning itself as purely anti-Western and instead focus on building stronger relationships and development opportunities among its members and partners. However, the summit also highlighted challenges. China's President Xi Jinping was absent for the first time since 2013, citing scheduling conflicts. Russian President Vladimir Putin also did not attend in person, addressing the meeting instead through a video link, given that he was facing an active warrant from the International Criminal Court. These absences were significant in terms of optics, as both leaders are seen as central figures in the group. Behind the scenes, there was an important debate over the pace of expansion. China and Russia pushed for rapid growth, seeking to bring in as many new members as possible to boost the bloc's scale and global reach. Brazil and India, however, argued for a more cautious approach. They wanted to ensure that new members were aligned with the organization's long-term goals and that rapid expansion would not dilute its cohesion or effectiveness. This divide revealed the underlying tension in the group. On one side, there was a vision of BRICS as a broad and fast-growing coalition capable of challenging existing global institutions. On the other side, there was concern about whether such rapid enlargement could create internal divisions, making it harder to reach consensus or act as a unified bloc. How this debate unfolds in the coming years could determine the future character of the organization. Despite these challenges, the momentum behind BRICS's growth appears strong. The fact that so many countries are eager to join indicates that the bloc is offering something that existing global structures are not. For many developing nations, membership in BRICS provides access to financing, market, and political influence that might otherwise be out of reach. At the same time, the bloc's expanding role has implications beyond economics. As BRICS continues to grow, it is increasingly being seen as part of a larger shift towards a more multipolar world. In such a system, power is not concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy Western nations, but distributed more evenly across different regions. For supporters of BRICS, this represents an overdue correction in the global balance of power. The Rio summit highlighted both the opportunities and the challenges of this transformation. On the one hand, BRICS now carries more weight than ever before, both in terms of population and economic scale. On the other hand, questions remain about how cohesive it can remain as it expands, and whether it will be able to balance the differing interests of its diverse membership. What is clear is that the group has moved far beyond its origins as a simple acronym. In just over a decade, BRICS has turned into a serious player in international politics and economics. The addition of new members such as Indonesia and the potential inclusion of states like Saudi Arabia mark a new chapter, one that could significantly reshape the way global decisions are made. The conflict began when the United States, under President Donald Trump, introduced a new wave of tariffs targeting BRICS members individually rather than as a group. This was presented as a response to what U.S. officials described as unfair trade practices, and in particular, the group's continued purchases of discounted Russian crude oil despite Western sanctions. The tariffs, however, quickly escalated into a broader standoff. China was the first to be hit. On Liberation Day in 2025, Washington announced steep import tariffs on Chinese goods. Beijing immediately retaliated, imposing duties that, at their peak, were reported to reach as high as 145%. These were later reduced to around 30%, but the initial reaction signaled just how far China was willing to go in defending its trade position. State media in Beijing presented the move as part of a strategy to deepen trade links within BRICS itself. Reports highlighted how China opened its domestic market more widely to fellow members, creating new channels of exchange that bypassed the US market altogether. India was the next target. Long considered by Washington as an important partner in Asia, India faced tariffs of 25%, which soon doubled to 50%. The move surprised many observers, given that Trump had previously spoken warmly about New Delhi, yet the action reflected the wider strategy of applying pressure to BRICS members one by one. For India, the tariffs added to the difficult balancing act of maintaining ties with both the United States and its BRICS partners. Brazil was also brought into the dispute. It faced 50% tariffs on key exports to the U.S. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, according to official statements, responded by urging a collective BRICS response rather than entering into direct negotiations with Washington. This position underscored the bloc's growing sense of solidarity in the face of external pressure. South Africa became another target, with 30% tariffs placed on its exports. In this case, the disagreement spilled over into political territory. President Trump accused South Africa of discriminatory policies against its white minority, an allegation that South African officials rejected outright. Reports suggested that while new restrictions were placed on trade, the United States continued to grant certain South African citizens special entry arrangements, further complicating the diplomatic picture. Russia, already under significant Western sanctions, did not face fresh tariffs from the United States. Instead, Moscow took on a different role within the group, positioning itself as a driving force behind BRICS' push for de-dollarization. Russian officials argued that reducing reliance on the US dollar in trade and financial transactions was essential for protecting member economies from external pressure. Central to this effort was the New Development Bank. Since its establishment in 2016, the bank had approved loans worth around $32 billion for nearly 100 projects. What made these loans distinctive was the option to issue them in local currencies, avoiding exposure to fluctuations in the dollar. For countries such as Egypt, Indonesia, and Ethiopia, this system was not only more convenient but also a necessity. Access to financing that did not depend on the dollar allowed them to pursue infrastructure and development projects without risking sudden shocks from currency markets. The financing model was also viewed as part of a broader shift in global governance. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres voiced the view that existing international financial structures were largely created by rich countries to benefit themselves. He pointed out that African states, for example, had virtually no role in shaping the Bretton Woods institutions that continue to dominate the world economy. Within this context, BRICS was increasingly described as a corrective, a platform where developing countries could sit at the table, shape the agenda, and pursue policies that reflected their interests. Energy quickly emerged as another area of strategic importance, with Russia already one of the world's largest energy exporters, and countries such as Iran and the United Arab Emirates joining the bloc. BRICS had gained substantial leverage in global energy markets. If Saudi Arabia were to finalize its membership, analysts argued that the bloc could potentially exert influence not only through sheer production capacity, but also through its connections to OPEC. This potential concentration of energy power worried Washington and its allies. Much of the concern centered on the possibility that BRICS members might conduct a greater share of oil trade in non-dollar currencies. Since the 1970s, the dominance of the US dollar in global oil transactions has been a cornerstone of American economic strength. If BRICS managed to shift even part of this trade away from the dollar, it could gradually weaken one of the main pillars of US financial influence. At the same time, the expansion of BRICS was not without risks. Each new member brought with it a different political system, distinct regional interests, and varying levels of economic development. Reaching consensus on key issues could become increasingly difficult as the group grew larger. The debate at the Rio summit about the pace of expansion had already shown how divided the members could be. The trade war added another layer of complexity. By targeting members one at a time, Washington may have hoped to create divisions within BRICS, betting that some countries would prioritize access to the US market over solidarity with the bloc. Whether this strategy would succeed remained uncertain. For some nations, the costs of confrontation with Washington were high. For others, the pressure seemed to strengthen their commitment to building an alternative system less vulnerable to external influence. What was undeniable was that the group's influence was no longer theoretical. With its expanding membership, its financial tools, and its collective control over significant energy resources, BRICS had become a central player in shaping the global economy. Its decisions were already affecting currency markets, energy pricing, and patterns of international investment. Observers pointed out that BRICS was increasingly positioning itself as a counterpart to the G7, the group of advanced economies traditionally seen as setting much of the global economic agenda. The growing connections between Brazil and China, for instance, highlighted how trade and investment flows within the bloc were deepening. These were not symbolic gestures, but practical measures that shifted economic activity towards a BRICS-centered network. For developing countries outside the bloc, the implications were considerable. Membership offered an alternative to the Western-led system, one that promised more favorable financing, access to new markets, and a greater role in shaping the rules of international trade. For established powers, however, the rise of BRICS represented a challenge to a system that had long supported their interests. The global stakes were therefore clear. As BRICS continued to expand, its choices about membership, trade policy, and financial strategy would have ripple effects across the world. A decision to admit new members from Latin America, for example, could shift trade flows across the Western Hemisphere. Moves to expand the role of local currencies in trade could affect foreign exchange markets worldwide. Changes in how energy exports were priced and sold could influence oil prices and, by extension, the cost of living in countries far beyond the bloc's borders. The future of BRICS also raised questions about unity. Could a group made up of so many diverse nations maintain a common direction? Would the pressure from trade disputes and geopolitical tensions ultimately bring members closer together or push them apart? These uncertainties made it difficult to predict exactly how the bloc would evolve, but they also underscored its importance. By 2025, it was clear that BRICS was no longer a marginal player. Its expansion, its financial experiments, and its growing control over key resources positioned it as a force capable of shaping the global economy. Whether this would result in a more balanced international order or new forms of competition remained an open question. For now, one fact stood out. The world was no longer defined solely by the institutions and rules set by the West. With BRICS expanding and consolidating its influence, the shape of global power was being redrawn in real time. Governments, businesses, and citizens everywhere would feel the effects of this transformation. From currency exchange rates to energy prices, the next steps for the bloc would be closely watched, as they were certain to influence not only its members, but the wider international community. Whether BRICS would achieve unity or struggle with fragmentation, its growing weight ensured that its role in shaping the future could not be ignored.